again, I wanted to emphasize some of the good news. Uh, One is that a study that looked at thousands of pregnant women and followed their children for years afterwards found that regardless of exposure to stress in the womb, a nurturing environment after birth can provide the child with enormous potential to change the course of development. As I mentioned before, this is known as developmental plasticity. Um, at this point, I want to mention one other factor, which has the potential, but only in the aftermath. And this is various forms of psychotherapy, which might be able to reduce epigenetic damage. I mean, I find that quite amazing that a person can go through a therapeutic session and it's so powerful that it gets into your cells and reverses maybe, decades of epigenetic regulation. But I've talked to a number of people, Michael Meany, for example, Moshe Ziff, Thomas Boyce, Arthur Janoff, who works with primal therapy, and they all believe, and these are all experts in the field, they believe that it's possible to reverse epigenetic damage with the right kind of therapy and measure those changes. Now, of course, it's much better to prevent the damage in the first place for all the obvious reasons. And to prevent it, we need to look at inequality. So here, for example, are some stats from the United States, the richest nation in the world, that maternal mortality, which of course is going to is bad in itself and has a huge effect on children. Maternal mortality rates have gone up in the U.S. They've nearly doubled, while the rest of the world is actually getting better. And infant mortality, according to the Center for Disease Control, the U.S. ranks 55th in the world when it comes to protecting newborn babies. Greece is the 43rd, Japan's number 1, for instance. And the key element here is, again, socioeconomic inequality. In a sense, in a very real sense, you can have countries which are poorer than the richer countries, and they will still have better health outcomes because there's less equality. There is more available in terms of health care, for example. There's not as many people that are hungry and starving and so on. At the same time, of course, if we look at the really poor parts of the world, I mean, it's difficult and stressful to try and survive on, say, $2 a day. But that's what about 1 billion people in the world have to cope with. On the other hand, again, it's, as a study in Canada pointed out, it's not medical treatments or lifestyle choices, but rather the living conditions that people experience. For example, how income and wealth are distributed, whether or not we are employed, if so, the working conditions that determine health, and all kinds of different outcomes. I'll go over some of them in a minute. Inequality is growing, both globally and within countries, and its negative effects on society and parents inevitably results in massive harm to children. This is the quote I gave you earlier about how poverty can literally cause significant brain damage in children. A really important study of the effects of inequality came out about 2008, a book called The Spirit Level. And it's kind of ironic because it's all about, as you'll see, charts and numbers and graphs. But it's not about any religious experience or anything. But what they point out is that almost everything that's vital to a healthy community, from life expectancy to mental illness to crime rates, is affected by how equal or unequal a society is. The more equally the wealth is distributed, you get a reduction, for example, in depression, obesity, homicides, imprisonment rates, teenage pregnancies, low birth weight, and infant mortality. Living conditions are critical in terms of, again, employment, working conditions, the minimum wage, the health and social safety net, recreation, and play. Now, one of the things that the neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp has pointed out is that, like most mammals, like all other mammals, one of the 7 primary processes in our brain is the need to play. In fact, I heard one researcher last year saying that, and it's a bit of an oversimplification, but what he said was, it's not so much that we get old and stop playing, but we get older if we faster if we stop playing. So having the chance, having the energy and the enthusiasm to play is critical to our survival as well. Now, here are some examples of how inequality ranked by nations, and I'll go through this kind of slowly in case you want to take a look at this, how inequality affects, for example, in general, health and social programs. So you see at the bottom, let's see if this works. Yeah, there's Japan. Japan has some of the best measures of equality and the lowest health and social problems. The U.S. is completely the opposite. Okay, and you can see here countries that are known for their quality of life. Again, Scandinavian countries, for example, are doing fairly well. Canada's in the middle. Greece is kind of in the middle. But then, the U.K. And so on. This is an overall picture of how critical it is to have a more egalitarian society. Child well-being in particular, again, you see the same kind of patterns. So the U.S. here is at the bottom where there's high income inequality and fairly low results. You see Japan a little bit higher, and again, the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Spain, and so on. Greece is again in the middle. And we'll see this pattern in all these charts. So, and they've also done a study not only between nations, but in the United States, and looked at all 50 U.S. states, and the same patterns appear. You have a healthier population, fewer suicides, fewer teen pregnancies, where there's more social and economic equality. Again, Japan is doing the best, the U.S. is doing the worst, and most of us are somewhere in the middle. There's a fantastic book written by Bruce Alexander called The Globalization of Addiction. And one of his central points, is that more we don't have a sense of community, the more we're stressed out, surprisingly, we turn more to some kind of, not just drugs, he's talking about addictions. People can be addicted to fashion, to television, to Facebook, anything, sports. And it's very often a way, again, to cope with the emotional pain of isolation, of stress, and so on. And I think some of that's reflected in this particular chart. Here's a very telling one. You put it all together, life expectancy is longer in more equal, rich countries. And again, the obvious point, if you're living in a very poor country like Haiti, for example, or not even to mention the horrors going on, say, in Iraq right now, in addition to the violence and so on, you're going to have a short life. And when you're poor, and you can't get enough food, it's going to make a huge difference. But once you reach a certain minimum threshold, where you have enough to eat and you've got a place to stay, then increased wealth does not make much of a difference, and it does not make people happier. Again, the same point that I showed earlier in terms of the U.S. specifically, we see the same kind of patterns of infant mortality rates. So the USA is the worst, and again, it's the richest country in the world. One of the points that Sherry was talking about in terms of the guaranteed annual income study in Manitoba, there was another study that just was done a few weeks ago. I think it was Manitoba, I'm not 100% sure. Another province where without any kind of stipulation, they gave all single mothers an extra $81 a month. No strings attached. Here's a little, $81 is not that much. Yet they found that their outcomes at giving birth and the child's health afterwards had a significant improvement. $81 a month. This is one of the reasons that I think Bertrand Russell and Murray Bookchin and so on were right, that there's no excuse that we can't afford to take care of people. And I'll give you some specific examples in just a second, but we have more than enough wealth to deal with all of these issues. Another outcome, educational scores. Finland's at the top. In Finland, and if you've seen Michael Moore's latest film, Where to Invade Next, it's not about the military. He goes to countries in Europe and North Africa to find examples of how programs should be run. And he goes to Finland, and apparently the average time that you're in school in Finland when you're a kid is like 4 hours a day, and there's no homework. They had other elements of the program, but it pays off. Now, I want to mention some of the horrors again that also we need to understand to motivate making change. About 40%, and these are all preventable, about 40% of the millions of deaths every year around the world are caused by water, air, and soil pollution. We don't have to allow that to happen. 1.1 billion people lack access just to safe water. And again, it's not just in, quote, third world countries. You might hear about what happened in Flint, Michigan. The Republicans wanted to save money. They messed with the water system, and children are dying. These claims millions of children's lives every year. About 300,000 women die every year in childbirth. The amount of money it would take to save almost all of them is about 4 or 5 fighter jets. So any one country, Greece, Canada, could say, let's buy 5 fewer fighter jets and we'll make sure that women around the world get the kind of prenatal care they need. For me, the most horrific figure of all is that almost 6 million children, just the ones under the age of 5, died in 2015. That's nearly 6,000 a day, 16,000 a day. So between now and this time tomorrow, 16,000 more young children are going to die, and almost all of those deaths are preventable. It would literally cost a few dollars per child. Prematurity was one of the main causes. Again, not giving, and again, this is found, the study I mentioned in Manitoba, it reduced rates of premature babies by giving $81 a month. Okay. The second greatest problem was infections and then hunger, all of which can be dealt with. And there's an example of what could be done, but you never hear about it. When the Sandinistas came to power in Nicaragua in 1979, after overthrowing the US-backed dictatorship under Somoza, they made development a priority in their country. And I could give you many examples. I could go on for hours about how they reduced illiteracy and so on, gave rights to women, equal rights. I think the most significant fact in this context is that within a few years they cut infant mortality in half. They were a poor country. They'd just gone through a civil war. They were opposed by the United States, and the U.S. started a war of terrorism against them, as you know. And yet, in spite of that, they cut infant mortality in half because it was a priority. The Lancet argued that it would cost only $5 billion to save the lives of these 6 million children every year. $5 billion. What's that? To almost any of the advanced nations. Okay, the good news again, there are solutions. As I mentioned, there's more than enough wealth, resources, and knowledge to deal with all of these issues. Perhaps the simplest and most rational way is to cut military spending. What the military spends globally is around $1.7 trillion a year. You could eliminate the worst elements of global poverty for 1/5 of that. So if all the nations said, we're going to cut our military budget by 1/5, nobody would get ahead. But you could eliminate global poverty. Another figure which is even more incredible, the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq alone are going to cost about $4 trillion overall. Imagine if the U.S. said, instead of killing people, we're going to help farmers, we're going to help pregnant women. Would anybody want to blow up the towers? I mean, come on. Sorry, I'm getting political here, but you know. The total economic cost of wars last year, not just the money spent on it, but the damage done, the environmental damage, the destruction of homes, economies, and so on, was $10 trillion. $10 trillion. Nobel Prize-winning American economist James Heckman noted another way to prevent suffering and reduce the cost of society. He said, every dollar invested in the very young not only saves lives, but prevents illness, but will save $7 to $14 down the road in health costs, policing, courts, whatever. So even if a person's a fiscal conservative, should be able to understand, invest in children. Even if you don't care about them, you'll save money. Governments could stop subsidizing fossil fuel corporations, which are destroying the environment. The last report from the IMF said we as tax-paying citizens, are giving fossil fuel companies $500 billion a year in subsidies of various kinds. We could take that back and again end global poverty. A Robin Hood tax on international financial speculations, also known as a Tobin tax, would reduce insecurity in the global markets, but also come up with again $200 to $300 billion from speculators, currency speculators. They would lose that, but that could end global poverty. But then you look at things that matter. When Wall Street collapsed, the U.S. government spent upwards of $1 trillion bailing out the banks, not the people who lost their homes, but the banks. And at Goldman Sachs, one of the major hedge fund villains in this picture, some of their executives in 2009, after the crash, got bonuses of $1 billion each or more for what they had done. And when the head of Goldman Sachs was asked, how can you justify that? He said, quote, "We're doing God's work." And you can't argue with God, so there. On the other hand, as Canadian economist Jim Stanford explains, the financial industry is not in itself productive. He agrees with Adam Smith and Karl Marx that only human labor creates value. Because this was the quotation from James Heckman. Every dollar invested in children beyond the humanitarian measure saves money down the road, if you need that kind of economic argument. And there's the quote from the head of Goldman Sachs. Here's the latest information from Oxfam. 62 people. You could fit 62 people in here. They have more wealth than half the world's population, 3.6 billion. And those on average, those 62 people, have as much wealth as 57 million people, which is what, all of Southern Europe and part of Eastern Europe. 62 people. Again, one could first argue, do they deserve it? Have they earned it? Are they that much smarter and harder working than the rest of us? On the other hand, don't they have an obligation when it's so little of their wealth would make all the difference? For example, I should mention also that this came out before the Panama Papers and all the information about the tax havens that rich corporation individuals have stashed, according to one report in the Guardian, I believe, up to $32 trillion is stashed in offshore tax havens. Now, keep in mind that while the average worth of the world's billionaires is $58 billion, the poorest half of the world, 3.6 billion, are worth $489 versus 58 billion. As Darwin observed, if poverty is not caused by nature, then great is our sin. And I would argue the primary reason for all of these social, economic, and environmental problems, the reason they exist and the reason they ignore it, is the global capitalist system. Greed is the only thing that matters. Success is what happens, is what makes you survive. The alternative, of course, is to try and create a more fair and democratic society. And to do that, we need the thousands and tens of thousands of social movements that already exist around the world. We need to take part in that. We need to support them. And economic class domination is the single biggest obstacle, as I've said. One person who surprisingly agrees with that is Warren Buffett, one of the richest billionaires in the United States. He said, yeah, there is a class war going on, and my class is winning. And they see, again, the growing inequality in the world. I'll just mention a quick historical point. When Columbus first set out on his voyages to discover the, quote, New World, around the world as a whole, there wasn't much economic inequality between different parts of the world. Of course, there were ruling elites and poor people. But people in the Americas overall had a similar standard of living to people in Africa and Europe and Asia. As capitalism is spread, we see the inequalities growing worse and worse all the time. And as the 0.1% get richer, they get more politically powerful. That's why Nobel Prize winners like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman are saying people have to get political power in order to reduce the power of the corporate class. And there's obviously a lot of ways that we can do that. In terms of specific issues, demand fairer taxation, a guaranteed annual income, more democracy, a social safety net like in Scandinavian countries, make children's health a priority, protect the environment for all the obvious reasons, and support programs like the Nurse Family Partnership, which focuses on low-income, vulnerable first-time mothers and their babies. In discussing this in the book, The Nurture Effect, Anthony Bigland talks about the improvement in women's prenatal health, improved child health and development, fewer unintended subsequent pregnancies, increase in father involvement, and a 48% reduction in child abuse and neglect. Basically, you have a nurse go out, there's no charge, it's available to every couple, every parent, and she or he can help with all the issues they have, breastfeeding, how to sleep, you don't, when your child's crying, you don't ignore them and you never spank them. All those basic things. They have a huge effect. Bigland also writes about the toxic effects of a worldwide system of corporate capitalism that increases poverty and inequality while promoting materialistic values. And I want to quote here something I heard from David Corton a couple of years back. He publishes Yes magazine, some of you may know it, and he's written some really important books. And he said, to corporations, life is not sacred, money is. And again, that should be fairly obvious. One of the gurus of global capitalism, Milton Friedman, he won a Nobel Prize in economics, he's an American, Chicago school, said, quote, corporations have no social responsibility other than to make as much money as they can for their shareholders, end quote. And that's the way it works. There's a great film made by the Canadian lawyer Joel Backen called The Corporation, where he explores all of this. I highly recommend that one as well. The idea of creating a nurturing environment is not new. It was in Plato's Republic, written 2,500 years ago, and right in this city, which I think is kind of cool. In conclusion, and I thank you for your patience, a global system which allows tens of millions of people to die every year from preventable causes, while it wastes trillions of dollars on war and the destruction of nature, is pathological. We created the system, we can stop it. And of course, it's the same here in Greece, where the corporate masters of the Troika are imposing horrible suffering on the people here. Some of you may have heard of Noam Chomsky. His definition of austerity says it's class struggle by another name, and I think that's bang on. While there are many complex causes for the horrors in the world, global systems of wealth and power, I believe, are the main problem, and at the risk of gross oversimplification. The capitalist economic system are responsible for these issues, for condemning millions of people to death every year, for destroying the environment, and for making most people's lives nasty, brutish, and short. However, by working together, I think we can make the change. And again, this was the quote earlier from Albert Einstein. It's not only the economic predations of capitalism, it's what it does to us as individuals, making us compete against each other, celebrating narcissism. And the movie The Corporation, for instance, what it does, it takes this internationally recognized standard for measuring if people are psychopaths or not, and applies it to corporate behavior. And there's a strong match, not concern for other people, having one focus on promoting yourself and so on. And again, I think that that's not the way we are as human beings, and I don't think it's healthy for us. And I think if we do get together, again, it's the obvious stuff: promote democracy, reduce poverty, end wars. We could do that, and then we create that kind of social environment, then almost everybody will thrive. Thank you very much for your patience. Questions, comments, disagreements? Is it so obvious what I said? Yes.
That was very good and very clear, thank you. But I have a question. I think that all of us were quite taken by the series of graphs where you had inequality on the x-axis
Yes.
Could you please explain to me exactly how they classify that inequality? Like, do they just take a median? You know, normally we would think of a median income for a country, but what is the inequality measure?
Okay, it's something called the Gini coefficient, and without getting it, GINI. Yeah, not the one that comes out of the thing. GINI coefficient, and that's a standard model for measuring inequality in various countries, and in this case also within states in the United States, as I mentioned. And so we look at that measure of inequality, and then say, okay, what's their rates of teen pregnancies, of suicides, of incarcerations, and that's the data from the charts. You can go online and get these charts, by the way, and a lot more explanation, or get the book. It gives you tons of information. A lot of details, as you can imagine. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Okay.
I think my curiosity is because I am from Australia, and we have quite a very liberal, generous welfare system. So when we were sort of featuring over there, looking quite bad, I was wondering why. That's why my curiosity was aroused.
Right. Maybe some other countries are doing even better, especially the Japan and the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, sometimes it has to do with the baseline as well. That's why I was
Right.
curious as to the measure.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. It was very exciting, your presentation. I want to ask if you are politically active, because you suggest to be active citizens.
Some ways to be active citizens, you mean?
You suggest
Oh.
to be active citizens.
Yeah. Okay. There's several ways, many ways to do it. In fact, this is one of the brighter points about the situation in a sense. There are so many problems that you can decide what's most important to you, what's most interesting to you, what you have the best qualifications. So it might be working in say, low-income neighborhoods to help children. It might be working in low-income neighborhoods to help mobilize people to vote. Now, voting isn't the only answer, but I think it's a very important one for all the obvious reasons. And again, you can organize people to have demonstrations if that's what you want to do. One thing I didn't mention, but I think is absolutely critical, is that we're talking about nonviolent civic resistance. That's a given. In fact, a study came out a few years ago looking at, since 1900, at resistance, whether it was, say, in Eastern Europe against Soviet domination, whether it was resistance here against the junta, all around the world. They looked at every example of resistance, and they found, first of all, that nonviolent resistance was more successful than violent resistance for a number of reasons. They also found that, and this is what's encouraging, in every one of these cases, all you needed was the active, ongoing involvement of 3.5% of the population. And whether we're talking about democratic societies or more dictatorial, eventually they won. Again, the work that the civil rights movement did in the U.S. is a good example of that. But I mean, there are just so many areas where we need to work. In Vancouver just now, and in other parts of the world, they've been having blockades against more pipelines for fossil fuels and so on. Part of the problem is that I think people don't know how bad things are, and they don't know how relatively easy it would be to make a change. And so it's like, what's the point? I'll just go home and watch, a soccer game or something. And that's fine. Everyone needs a break. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but there's just so many fields. You can find what's best for you in terms of your background and interests and so on. And again, the principles that they all need to embody are things like respect for other people, democracy, self-determination. There's a group in Vancouver called the Metro Vancouver Alliance, and it's a movement of three main groups: community groups, trade unions, and faith groups. And one of their key principles is they focus on what they have in common, not their differences, because there's always differences, and you're not very effective. You're always fighting, well, I have the right line. No, you do. Let's try and work together. And again, the other element along those lines is be as inclusive as possible. Try and make connections, find out what you have in common with people. And another, just from my own experience, keep in mind you don't have to do it all yourself. Other people will do their share, and then you'll make progress. And we have been making progress. I mean, we often are not aware or being reminded of the successes we've had. And I'm speaking mostly from a North American context, but it was the resistance, well, around the world, but also North America, to the U.S. invasion of Vietnam that prevented Nixon from using nuclear weapons on the Vietnamese, which he wanted to do. And he said, I don't care about the body count. But he was told the political damage would be too great, and that prevented nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Reagan wanted to invade Nicaragua, but primarily American opposition stopped that. The whole new Cold War, there was global opposition to the buildup of nuclear weapons, and it got turned around. We don't often hear about these victories, not to mention the smaller victories, in municipal elections and so on. But it does make a difference, and I think it's the only thing that will make a difference. And as people work with each other, as they learn about the issues, we all become better people and better citizens. Aristotle, who taught here as well, talked about human beings as being a zoon politikon, a political animal, and not just in the narrow sense of politics, but a social animal. And again, I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, that's critical, and we all thrive in that kind of environment when we can bring out the best in ourselves. Trust me, I could go on for hours, but I'll stop now. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this really interesting lecture. I was wondering about the social epigenetics. Maybe I didn't get it. You said about physical deaths of the children, all the grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if there are any mental consequences, maybe neurological or psychological.
Yeah, and the question was, are there sort of mental and emotional and neurological damage all the time? In fact, I would say that's probably more common than some of the other things, the more dramatic things like cardiovascular disease and early deaths. It's this idea that the traumas that we can't adjust to in a normal way overwhelm us. I think it was Abraham Maslow who first posited this idea that if we're always trying to defend ourselves, because it's important to keep in mind, let's just say you're a fetus in a womb, essentially your body is learning about what the world's going to be like, what your environment is like. And if it's harsh, if it's not getting the nutrients it needs, if there's chemicals, it tries to make those various adjustments. And Maslow's point is that if you're trying to defend against threats, then your energy and your nutrients are going into that and not into healthy development. And in a larger sense, and this is when I was bringing up the psychotherapy issue, that it causes things like depression, perhaps bipolar. One of the earlier presentations today was talking about epigenetics and bipolar disease and autism and so on. A lot of that still has to be sorted out. But absolutely, that's where I think we're most vulnerable, in our central nervous system. And in some ways, it may be the most subtle, because it's not obvious as somebody having a medical condition that you can easily diagnose. Is that what you were asking? Or? Okay. Anyone else? 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your attention and your presence and the questions. And have a great day in Athens.